We forecast prices and fundamentals. Whether you're a trader, producer, or consumer, you can hedge your bets with Montel's diverse forecasting portfolio. Contact us at sales@montelnews.com for more info and a free trial.
Hello listeners and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing energy matters in an informal setting. In a landmark pod, we have reached number 100 listeners. We will discuss very ambitious plans for the rollout of hydrogen and ammonia in the Nordic markets. In the space of under 12 months, hydrogen, both green and blue, has gone from being niche to mainstream, from being the focus of small research institutes and companies to the involvement of the oil majors. Other parts of Europe, notably in the Netherlands, Germany, as well as Portugal and Spain, have ambitious plans for hydrogen. But recent announcements in Norway, Sweden and Denmark indicate that Northern Europe does not want to be left out of the expansion of hydrogen and ammonia. Joining me, Richard Sverrisson, to discuss these issues are several prominent analysts and experts who will share their expertise and knowledge on the implications for the Nordic power market, as well as a representative from the exciting pilot project Hybrid in Sweden. So a warm welcome to you, Martin Pay.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome back, Marius Holm, Rennesund of Thema Consulting.
Thank you very much.
And hello, Kathrine Stene Bakke of AFRY.
Hi.
Welcome back to you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Olav Botnen of Volue, formerly Whatsite. A pleasure to welcome you, Olav.
Thank you so much.
If I could start with you, Martin, could you tell us a little bit about the Hybrid project in Sweden and the ambitions you have here? I mean, the ambition is here to produce fossil-free steel by 2026. Is that right? How do you plan on doing this?
Yes, absolutely. That's our plan. The Hybrid initiative was started in 2016 by SSAB teamed up with Vattenfall and LKB in Sweden. The reason behind the initiative was that the steel industry, which is extremely important for our modern society, unfortunately today emits a huge amount of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And the reason for that is mainly the process that we use to make steel from iron ore. Currently, worldwide, the steel industry emits about 7% of global CO2 emission every year. And that depends on the blast furnace process, where we take iron ore and reduce iron ore with coal in a blast furnace process and moving on to make the high quality steel products we do. For the industry to really contribute to both the development of society and cut emissions, we really need to develop a new breakthrough technology to make steel from iron ore. And that is where hydrogen comes into the picture. We recognized since a long time back that hydrogen is a very good reducing agent to do this work, but has never been commercialized to a scale where it can be, deployed by the industry as a whole. So in the Hybrid initiative we started in 2016, we created a joint venture company. We invested hugely in research development activities. And then we decided in 2018 to build the pilot plant facilities that we are currently running. So we are in a very exciting phase of technical development. We very soon, in a couple months from now on, we will start to test using hydrogen at a larger scale to make steel without using fossil fuel. So that will be the moment of excitement in this technical development. And our plan is to scale this up in 2025. So from 2026, SSAB, together with the partners that we are working together with, will deliver fossil-free steel on the market at a large scale. So that is our plan to really revolutionize this industry.
Very, very interesting, Martin. I mean, could you tell us what are the implications here for the energy markets? I mean, how much renewable energy would you require then by 2026 and further on?
Yes, essentially what we really want to do is to replace coal that we use in the industry with electricity. So in principle, we will need roughly the same amount of energy from renewable and electricity sources instead of shipping coal around the globe. In that way, we will cut emissions. On the other hand, we will need a lot of green electricity. For SSAB to do this in Sweden, we have estimated that if we phase out the blast furnace process that we use today, going through the hybrid route completely, we will need 15 terawatt hours of electricity annually to do this. And that corresponds to roughly 10% of Sweden's annual electricity consumption. So this will stimulate very much the renewable energy industry in Sweden.
This is by 2026, or are you talking further down the line, these 15 terawatt hours?
Further down the line, our plan is to phase out all our blast furnace processes before 2045. So the first plant is 2026. So then it will happen gradually.
So these obviously has huge implications for the power market in the region, which I'll return to later with our distinguished analysts. But is this going to be purely wind, or is it going to be a combination of wind, solar, batteries? How do you see the expansion here? What kind of renewable energy are we talking here, Martin?
Yeah, in Sweden, we have a quite good starting point, especially in northern part of the country, where we have also access to iron ore mines in Botnen, where we have quite good access to hydropower at the moment. But we see very strong development of wind coming in the coming years. The last few years, wind power has been developing very fast, and we see continued growth of wind power, especially in northern part of Sweden, Norway, and Finland. There are many very exciting projects there. In the hybrid initiative, we are also developing a hydrogen underground storage technology, and that we see is going to be an extremely important component to integrate the steel-making process with the electricity grid, especially with increasing percentages of wind power. So we will create the buffering capability, so we'll benefit also the wind power investment projects. So we can store energy in form of hydrogen, which then can be used for iron ore reduction.
Just a final question. I know, Martin, you have to dash off. There are other plans in Sweden. I know your project inspired the H2 Green Steel initiative. Is there enough energy to go around, or just means that there's going to be more and more having to be built out in that area of Sweden?
Yeah, it is, of course, very encouraging that other companies, especially new startups, see the hybrid project, believe in the technology, and really want to put big money to invest in this area. It will create, I believe, a healthy competition among us. The world needs more fossil-free steel, not less.
Absolutely.
The question is then, of course, how to do it. In the short term, it will create, say, competition of available electricity. But in the long run, we believe that this will stimulate more investment.
Martin, thanks ever so much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast, and good luck with the project. I think it's something that we all wish success for.
Thank you very much.
Olav, can I turn to you, and could you maybe talk us through? So we've heard about the Swedish example. We've also seen a spate of announcement recently in Nordics. Could you talk us through what's on the table at the moment, and do you see any more coming in the pipeline?
Yes, we have seen a lot of new projects coming into the pipeline during the latest months. And just 1 year ago, we didn't have anything of those projects in our pipeline, in fact. So quite a lot of things have happened recently. And I think north of Sweden is probably the most intensive price zone when it comes to new hydrogen projects, because you have nearly an endless capacity in new onshore wind parks available there. So I think it's quite easy for bringing in even more volumes up in the very north end of Sweden. But we also have quite a lot of projects in the rest of Scandinavia. Hybrid is also present in Finland, for instance, and we expect also some volumes there. And in Norway, we expect this Yara to go electric in 5-6 years from now. And we also see some minor projects up in the very north end of Norway for producing hydrogen for ferries up there. And we also see quite a lot of projects in Denmark related to offshore wind farm generation and new energy islands there. So it's all over now, and I think north of Sweden will be the most intensive part when it comes to hydrogen production, because this endless stream of onshore wind capacity up there.
Thank you, Olav. I mean, this is quite a transformation, I think, isn't it, Kathrine, that we've seen, in the space of a year, as Olav said, it gone from very little to all these projects. I mean, what do you find exciting about this new sort of hydrogen world, or these plans for hydrogen?
Well, there's a lot of things that's exciting about this. First of all, it's giving hope, in the decarbonization agenda. It is, in a way, looks like it's finally happening. That being said, there has been hydrogen booms, not being realized before. So there is still some way to go, but some of these projects that we are seeing now, they are getting further, they are technically feasible. And it's still maybe some way to go to have them sort of commercially and economically feasible, but still there is a lot of exciting things happening. And there is also a lot of obstacles and things that needs to happen for this to be realized at a large scale. And that creates a lot of interesting discussions for people like me and Marius and Olav, I guess, as well as for the industry. And I think also we are starting to see some new players coming in, like this Age to Green Steel project, for instance. Yes, there are some people there who are, familiar with the industry, but there are also some very new people. They come from different industries and have different backgrounds. And that is also quite interesting to see.
I mean, I think, Marius, if I can bring you in here, Kathrine mentioned obstacles. So this sort of brings me on to my next questions. These are all just plans. Will they all be realised, or do you expect some of them to fall by the wayside? Or maybe a second wave of additional plans even?
Yeah, I mean, I think not all of them will definitely not be realized, but looking at it both in the Nordic level, but also in the European level, there's so many projects now that we're on a good way to actually reaching some of the European targets on electrolyzer capacity that was set out by the European Union in their hydrogen strategy. We just had a count last week when we were preparing our price forecast, and the EU has a target of electrolyzer capacity of about 40 gigawatts in 2030. Looking at the different projects across Europe, we see that there's projects worth of 25 gigawatts already. Of course, not all of them will be realized, but there will be more coming along. I mean, those 25 gigawatts has basically been announced during the past 6 months or so. So we're definitely on the way here. And I think the combination also with offshore wind and hydrogen, it's necessary, as Kathrine said, to be able to reach the net zero emission targets from the European Union. So although we've had kind of hydrogen booms in the past, I think what we now see, it's taking it a step further. We have the European or the EU strategy on hydrogen. We see 6 other European countries already have released their strategies, another 9 countries in the pipeline. So everybody is taking this seriously and try to find out how to best position themselves in this new market.
You mentioned the 40 gigawatt electrolyzer capacity, Marius. What does that translate to in terms of power capacity? What do you need to build out to produce that amount of capacity?
That's significant capacity across Europe. I don't have it on top of my mind, the European total, but it's definitely a lot of extra demand across Europe. And I think when we look at it in the Nordic perspective, we expect 30 to 50 TWh of additional capacity or additional power production needed to produce hydrogen towards 2030. So it needs to be a significant build-out. And that's, one of the challenges here as well, particularly in Norway, where we see the opposition towards onshore wind. The regulator now changing the licensing system, that will take some time, so it won't get that much new capacity over the 6, 7, 8 next years. So for Norway, offshore wind might be the joker here that can create some extra production capacity when we move towards 2030.
Absolutely. So, Kathrine, you want to make a point here as well?
Yes, first of all, I think you touched upon a very important point when it came to what sort of production capacity in terms of renewable capacity do we really need? And one of my colleagues looked at this EU target and the target of 10 million tons of hydrogen in 2030. And it's also important that 10 million tons is only equivalent to what is currently the hydrogen demand in Europe being met by grey hydrogen. So it's basically just, if you use all to replace grey hydrogen, which is probably the sort of low-hanging fruit here, this is what we will be able to do by 2030. In order to do that, as Marius said, you would need 40 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity. And actually, if you were going to meet that by, for instance, onshore wind, which is the renewable with the highest load factor, you actually need 120 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity. And that is equivalent to the total, installed renewable energy capacity in Germany today. So it is enormous amounts of new energy that needs to come in. And I think this is going to be one of the limiting factors, actually, not only in Norway, as Marius says, but across. I mean, even in Norway, just to replace existing grey hydrogen, we need about 16 terawatt hours of new electricity. And it can't just be connecting to the grid either, because if it is going to be defined as green, they haven't finalized those discussions in, I think, around the EU taxonomy. But in order to be green, it needs to be new renewable capacity, demonstrably new, or at least otherwise curtailed. And also, it needs to be on the right side of the bottleneck. So producing a lot of hydrogen in, northern Sweden isn't going to help you if you're using it elsewhere, for instance. So there's a number of it's not obstacles, but there are a number of interesting aspects here that can, delay or create, dampen some of these very high ambitions.
Yeah, there's certainly many challenges. Olav, if I can bring you in here, what's your view here on, the expansion here, and then what does it mean in terms of growth? What kind of numbers do you see by 2030 in terms of actual increased supply or the increase from the power sector?
Yes, we expect like 17 terawatt hours of green hydrogen production by 2030 in the Nordic, but that's the figures was published before all the newcomers of projects was released some days ago. However, we expect that this 17 terawatt hours of new consumption will be replaced or will be fed by a combination of PPAs and new onshore wind, mostly in the northern part of Sweden, and in combination with eating up some of the recent oversupply, which we have observed during the latest years. So it's a combination, and that will bring us up to a more neutral power balance after all in the Nordic area. Some of the oversupply will disappear on the way to 2030, and then we are on the margin, on the price margin, we are then left to the European power margin, so to say. So that means the Nordic power prices are then creeping up more and more in line with the rest of Europe.
Yeah. So could you just talk us through some of these regulatory obstacles that Kathrine mentioned, and also the local opposition, the permitting process? Could we see more offshore wind along the coast of Norway meeting this demand?
Well, in Norway, it's difficult to see large volumes of offshore wind before 2030, but after 2030, it's possible when the LCOE for offshore wind is going to be lower than we observe nowadays. But we will also see some onshore wind development in Norway, but not in the large volumes as we have observed during the latest 3 years. So that means we will see lower onshore wind development in Norway going forward. And when we enter 2030, it will also be some offshore wind going to be developed in Norway. So it's a combination. And there will also be some minor solar generation to be developed in the Nordic area, both in Norway and the rest of the Nordics too.
So, Marius, what does this mean for prices? What's your view here on Nordic power prices? I know we've had a couple of years at least of very low prices in the Nordic region with the oversupply that Olav mentioned, mild winters, although we've had some weeks of very cold temperatures here and high spot prices. But we can say to 2030, is this going to boost demand and prices?
Olav also mentioned earlier, today we have a rather large power surplus in the Nordic market. So we will kind of eat of that surplus. So towards 2030, we don't see a very dramatic changes in the power prices. We've seen extremely low power prices for a while now, and then spiking in the beginning of the year. we expect more of a kind of a normalization of 40 to 45 euros over the coming decade. So they will increase, but not to extreme levels of any kind.
So kind of closer to the European level, as Olav mentioned as well?
Yeah, closer to the European level, but still there is a spread towards the German market. And I think also one thing that we haven't touched upon so far with hydrogen is that the flexibility it can provide, particularly in the continental market. And that's going to be extremely important going forward. Up until today, it's really the production side that has been ramping up and down. And when Europe is going towards more or less 100% renewable power sector, we need new forms of flexibility, and hydrogen can be one of them. First and foremost, with producing hydrogen when the renewable production is higher than demand. And when we look further out, and then we talk about more the 2040s, also some of that can come back to the power sector in hours where there is too little production. So it's one of the flexibility measures that will be important going forward, because you can store also rather large volumes of energy over longer time periods than, for example, a battery that will be more used for the shorter swings.
I want to return maybe to the other uses of hydrogen sort of towards the end of our discussion, but I think certainly, absolutely, this sort of flexibility is crucial. How about AFRY, Kathrine? What kind of view do you have on prices in the Nordic region with this massive increase in demand coming from the production of hydrogen?
Like Marius and Olav indicated, I think it has a lot to do with the volumes coming in. Because if you're looking, over the next decade, it's sort of 10, 20, something terawatt hours that it needed, maybe a bit more. Some of that might be also even be met by blue hydrogen or other sources. All other equal, it will push prices up, but pushing prices up, you will also allow for more wind being developed. So in a way, at the moment, what is limiting wind, especially in northern Sweden, is very low prices in the short term. If you increase the prices, this wind will come, and the price you will still be and then at a balanced level, and the price should be more or less the same, basically. But it's maybe more interesting and challenging to start looking beyond 2030. I mean, if all of these plans come in, we're not talking 20 terawatt hours, we're talking 50, 80, maybe 100 terawatt hours of new electricity, assuming that everything is realized. I know that is maybe a bit sort of ambitious. But if you add these kind of volumes into the market, that is a revolution, and that requires a lot of new grid. The flows will change between the markets. Flexibility, well, yes, hydrogen can offer flexibility, but that comes at the cost, because you have to then invest in overcapacity. If you're running an electrolyzer at less than base load, you're actually adding up quite a bit on the capex. So that is a very interesting, I think, aspect to look at. What's the system going to look like in sort of 35, 40, and not to mention when even more base load is going out with nuclear beyond that. So it's a gradual thing. Everything might develop quite smoothly, but you can also maybe see some really big shifts at a point in the future if this really takes off.
Absolutely. So Olav, what's your view here, and what do you think? Like Kathrine is saying, that an upturn in prices will also, incentivize more build and stimulate more sort of PPAs that you mentioned earlier as well.
Yes, when the recent oversupply is eaten up by 2030 approximately, then we expect that the new development of wind farms will go hand in hand with new hydrogen projects and bring us at a quite neutral power balance going forward. So that means it will be quite a balanced thing, and prices will then be nearly flat going forward, with wind farms being developed hand in hand with new hydrogen projects. So I don't think we will see major shifts after we have reached 2030 related to the fact that the power balance should be quite flat and neutral going forward then. But however, the first thing is that the recent oversupply will be reduced on the way to 2030, with more hydrogen projects coming in than the development of wind farms should be.
Marius, if I can turn to you, you mentioned flexibility earlier. I mean, are there other ways in which, if there's a lot of hydrogen green hydrogen being produced in the Nordics? Can it be exported to Europe? Could it be used for balancing the grid, as others have mentioned? What other uses can we see for green hydrogen?
No, I mean, I think we will see most of the hydrogen produced here being used in the industries across Europe and not coming back to the power sector. So we will definitely see some export, and that's an open question again, how we can transport that. I mean, we can use ships. We also saw that the gas infrastructure operators across Europe released a report some time back where they wanted to develop almost 7,000 kilometers of pipelines by 2030 to transport hydrogen to key consumption centers. We see also in Denmark, in the energy islands, that they want to produce hydrogen offshore. So there's a lot of different concepts here. But I think the key thing is that we will see more offshore wind, and we will have to transport that energy either in form of electrons or hydrogen to the big consumption centers across Europe.
Kathrine, if I could I'd just like to sort of round off the discussion a bit now, but cost is obviously a key factor here, and the cost of producing hydrogen, it's not unsubstantial. How do you bring these down, and what role does the carbon price play here potentially?
How to bring it down is clearly technological development. And luckily, we've seen that Europe or the world has been able to do that with renewable technologies before, and hopefully that will also be the case going forward. But also, it's, the fuel cost is a big part. No matter whether you're looking at the SMR, sort of blue hydrogen production, or you're looking at electrolyzers, the fuel cost is a really big part of the whole thing. And that is an advantage, of course, for the Nordics, because we generally have low electricity prices. And from a Norwegian perspective, we also have access to gas for blue hydrogen. And we haven't talked about that at all, but it is an important aspect of the Norwegian strategy. I think transport is expensive. So there is going to be a lot of, I think, analysis required and optimization processes required. Is it cheaper to transport hydrogen or, electrons through the grid? Over what distances? How do you store? Where do you store? Storing in salt caverns, for instance, is much cheaper than any other form of storage. You have them in Denmark, southern Sweden. So maybe that is where hydrogen can add flexibility or absorb flexibility. While in northern Sweden, I think it's much more difficult to see hydrogen playing a flexibility part. And of course, industry is going to be the big consumer, but nobody has mentioned transport sector. And transport sector has pockets, which is hard to electrify, like shipping or heavy-duty trucks. That is clearly also an area where hydrogen will play a part going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathrine. And just to round us off, Olav, what are your views here on bringing the costs down for hydrogen, green hydrogen?
The main thing is, of course, to scale up the processes. Nowadays, these electrolyzers are quite weak in capacity. We are talking about 10 and 20 megawatt. And in the future, I think we will see 100 and 200 megawatts of units going forward, and that will bring the cost down significantly. So I think upscaling is and technology development, of course, will be the main parts in bringing down the costs. And another thing, when it comes to transportation, I think ammonia will probably the easiest way to transport hydrogen in the form of ammonia, because ammonia can be used in transport sector and also in as fuel in power plants, thermal power plants, and also for the shipping fuel. So I think ammonia will be probably the key here for transportation sector, and even for power production when we are entering 2040, for instance. I know in the Japanese power plants, they're doing some experiments of using ammonia directly into coal-fired plants. So there is hope for ammonia to be a fuel in the power industry also.
There's several options on the table. Wouldn't you agree, Marius?
Yes, there's definitely a lot of options here, and it's a lot of uncertainty going forward. And we will see which technologies will win here eventually, but it will most likely be a combination of more than one of them as well.
Thank you ever so much, guys, for making this the 100th Montel Weekly podcast success, and a very, very stimulating and interesting discussion on the role of primarily green hydrogen, but also obviously blue and ammonia as well. So thank you very much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast this week, Marius, Kathrine and Olav.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or, let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.